It was a Thursday night taping of the Dean Martin Show in late 1968. Frank Sinatra was the guest star. The audience was packed, excited to see two-thirds of the legendary Rat Pack together on stage. Dean and Frank, the chairman and the king of cool, two of the biggest names in American entertainment. But something was off that night. Anyone who knew Dean could see it. His timing was slightly delayed, his words occasionally slurred. That famous, effortless cool seemed to require just a little more effort than usual. And the line between Dean Martin the performer and Dean Martin the person, that carefully maintained boundary between the drunk act and the man behind it, seemed dangerously thin. Dean had built his entire career on playing the lovable drunk, the guy with a glass in his hand, slightly tipsy, making everything look easy even while appearing just slightly impaired. It was an act, usually. The glass was often apple juice. The stumble was choreographed. The slurred word was timed for maximum comedic effect. But tonight, nobody was quite sure where the performance ended and reality began. Frank Sinatra noticed it immediately. He'd known Dean for over 20 years. They'd performed together hundreds of times, and Frank could tell when Dean was acting and when he wasn't. Tonight felt different, dangerous even. They'd gotten through the first segment okay, some banter, a song, the usual Rat Pack chemistry. But during the commercial break, as they walked off stage to reset for the next segment, Frank grabbed Dean's arm. "Dean," Frank said quietly, "you okay?" Dean smiled that trademark smile. "Never better, Pally. Why?" Frank studied his face. "You seem off." "It's the act, Frank, same as always." "Is it?" Dean's smile didn't waver. "Of course it is. What else would it be?" Frank didn't respond. He just watched Dean walk back toward his mark for the next segment. The stage manager was counting down, 30 seconds to air. The second segment started well enough. Dean and Frank did a duet, one of their old standards. Dean's voice was fine, strong even, but there were moments, small moments, where he seemed to lose his place, where he looked not at Frank but through him, where the performance seemed to require more concentration than it should. The audience didn't notice, or if they did, they thought it was part of the show. Dean Martin being Dean Martin, charming, loose, unpredictable. But Frank noticed, and it was making him increasingly uncomfortable. They finished the song to enthusiastic applause. Dean made a joke about forgetting the lyrics. The audience laughed. Frank didn't. As they walked off stage for another commercial break, Frank's jaw was tight. Dean headed toward his dressing room, but Frank followed him. The stage manager called out, 3 minutes to air." "Dean," Frank said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." "Not now, Frank. We're in the middle of a show." "That's exactly why we need to talk now." Dean turned to look at him. "What's your problem?" Frank glanced around. Crew members were moving equipment. The makeup artist was touching up another performer. People everywhere, but Frank didn't care. "You're embarrassing yourself," Frank said. The words hung in the air. Dean's expression didn't change. He just stared at Frank for a long moment. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Frank said. "You're embarrassing yourself, and you're embarrassing me." Dean's face went very still. The easy smile was completely gone. "Embarrassing you? We're supposed to be professionals, Dean. We're supposed to represent something, and tonight, you're not—" "I'm not what?" Dean interrupted. His voice was quiet, dangerous. "I'm not living up to your standards?" "You're not living up to your own standards," Frank shot back. "This isn't you. This isn't the Dean Martin I know. You're better than this." "Better than what, exactly?" Frank gestured vaguely. "This, whatever this is, the stumbling, the confusion. Whether it's real or it's an act that's gone too far, it doesn't matter. It looks bad. And I care about you too much to watch you do this to yourself." What Frank didn't know, what nobody except Dean and maybe a few stage crew members knew, was that the microphones were still hot. The commercial break had started, but the studio mics hadn't been cut. Every word of this conversation was being picked up, recorded, and in a few places, being heard. Dean looked at Frank for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You think you're helping me. I am trying to help you." "No," Dean said. "You're trying to control me. There's a difference." "Dean, Frank, I've been embarrassing myself for 30 years. That's my job. You should try it sometime." The words landed like a slap. Frank's face went red. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means you've spent your entire career trying to be perfect, trying to be taken seriously, trying to make sure nobody ever sees you as anything less than Francis Albert Sinatra, the chairman of the board. But me? I've never pretended to be anything other than what I am. A guy who makes people laugh. A guy who doesn't take himself too seriously. And if that embarrasses you, Frank, that's your problem, not mine." "I'm trying to look out for you," Frank said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "I didn't ask you to look out for me," Dean replied. "I asked you to be my friend, and friends don't humiliate each other in front of the crew." Frank glanced around. Only then did he realize how many people were watching, listening. The stage manager looked uncomfortable. A cameraman was pretending to adjust his equipment. The makeup artist had frozen mid-touch-up on another performer. "Dean," Frank started, but the stage manager interrupted. "We're back in 10 seconds." Dean turned and walked back toward the stage. Frank stood there for a moment, then followed. They took their marks. The countdown began. 5, 4, 3, and the show continued. But everything had changed. The audience might not have heard the argument, but they could feel the shift in energy. Dean and Frank went through the motions. They hit their marks. They said their lines. But the warmth was gone. The easy chemistry that had defined their relationship for 2 decades had evaporated. Dean made a joke. Frank smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Frank sang a song. Dean applauded, but mechanically. They did a sketch together. It fell flat, not because the writing was bad, but because neither of them was really there anymore. When the show finally ended, Frank walked off stage without looking at Dean. He went straight to his dressing room, grabbed his coat, and left the studio. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. Dean stood on the stage for a moment after the audience had filed out. The crew was breaking down equipment. Someone asked if he was okay. "Fine," Dean said. "Just fine." But he wasn't fine. Everyone could see that. The next day, the story spread through Hollywood. Dean and Frank had fought on Dean's own show. People who'd heard the hot mic conversation shared what they'd witnessed. The details got exaggerated in the retelling, but the core truth remained. Something had broken between Dean Martin and Frank Sinatra. Frank didn't call. Dean didn't reach out. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The Rat Pack continued to exist on paper, but the heart of it, the friendship between Frank and Dean, had been damaged in a way that proved difficult to repair. Other people tried to mediate. Sammy Davis Jr. called both of them, trying to broker peace. Joey Bishop suggested they meet for drinks. Peter Lawford, ever the diplomat, tried to organize a casual get-together. But Frank was stubborn, and Dean was proud, and neither was willing to be the first to apologize. "He called me an embarrassment," Dean told a friend months later. "On my own show, in front of my crew, how am I supposed to forgive that?" "He was trying to help you," the friend suggested. "Was he?" Dean asked. "Or was he trying to control me, to make me into the version of Dean Martin he wanted me to be?" Frank had his own version. "I watched my friend fall apart on stage, and when I tried to help, he threw it back in my face, told me I should try embarrassing myself, like I was the problem." "Maybe you approached it wrong," his confidant suggested. "Maybe," Frank admitted, "but I was scared. I've seen what happens when people in this business lose control, and I didn't want that for Dean." Years passed. The Rat Pack did occasional reunions. Dean and Frank were civil, professional. They could stand on the same stage and perform together, but the easy friendship, the brotherly love that had defined their relationship, never quite came back. There were moments, brief glimpses of the old warmth, a joke that landed just right, a glance that acknowledged the shared history, but it was never the same. In the 1980s, during one of the last Rat Pack performances, someone asked Dean about his relationship with Frank. "Frank's Frank," Dean said simply. "We've known each other a long time. We've been through a lot together. But some things, once they're said, you can't unsay them. You just have to live with them. Do you regret what you said that night?" Dean was quiet for a moment. "I regret that it happened. I regret that it had to be public. But the words themselves? No. I meant what I said. Frank was trying to control me, to make me perform the way he thought I should, and I couldn't let that happen. Even if it cost you the friendship, even then." Frank, in his own interviews, was less willing to discuss it. When asked about the incident, he'd usually deflect. "Dean and I are fine," he'd say. "We're friends, always have been." But people close to him knew differently, knew that Frank carried guilt about that night, that he wondered if he'd approached it wrong, if there was a way he could have expressed his concern without making Dean feel attacked. "I should have talked to him privately," Frank admitted to a close friend in the 1990s. "Not in the middle of a show, not where people could hear. I embarrassed him while accusing him of embarrassing himself. That was wrong." "Did you ever tell him that?" Frank shook his head. "Pride's a hell of a thing. By the time I realized I'd handled it badly, too much time had passed, and neither of us knew how to bridge that gap." The incident became one of those legendary moments in Rat Pack history. Different versions circulated. Some said Dean had been legitimately drunk that night. Others insisted it was all an act that Frank misunderstood. A few claimed the whole thing was staged for publicity. But the people who were actually there knew the truth. It had been real, messy, complicated. Two friends who loved each other but couldn't find a way to communicate when it mattered most. Dean Martin died in 1995. Frank Sinatra was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. He stood there in his dark suit, his face expressionless as they lowered his friend into the ground. After the ceremony, someone asked Frank how he was doing. "I lost my friend a long time ago. Tonight, I just buried him." "You two reconciled, didn't you?" Frank shook his head. "We made peace. That's not the same as reconciling. We learned to be in the same room together. We learned to work together. But we never got back what we lost that night." "Do you wish you'd handled it differently?" Frank looked at the grave for a long moment. "Every day. Every single day." The story of Frank Sinatra telling Dean Martin he was embarrassing himself became more than just a moment of conflict between two friends. It became a lesson about the limits of good intentions, about how trying to help someone can sometimes hurt them instead, about how concern can look like control, about how friendship requires not just love, but also respect for boundaries. Frank Sinatra loved Dean Martin. Nobody who knew them doubted that. But that night, Frank's love expressed itself as judgment, as an attempt to make Dean into someone he wasn't, or to force Dean to be someone Frank thought he should be. And Dean, who'd spent his entire career crafting a specific image, who'd walked the tightrope between performance and reality for decades, couldn't accept that. Couldn't let Frank or anyone dictate how he presented himself. Both men were right, and both were wrong. Frank was right to be concerned, wrong in how he expressed it. Dean was right to defend his autonomy, wrong in how harshly he rejected Frank's concern. And the result was that two of the closest friendships in entertainment history never quite recovered. They continued to exist in each other's lives, continued to perform together occasionally, continued to maintain the public image of Rat Pack brotherhood. But the real friendship, the one where they'd call each other at 2 a.m. just to talk, where they'd show up at each other's houses unannounced, where they'd defend each other against anyone, that friendship ended the night Frank said, "You're embarrassing yourself." And Dean replied, "I've been embarrassing myself for 30 years. That's my job." The words themselves weren't unforgivable, but the hurt behind them, the damage to trust, the revelation that they saw each other so differently, That proved too much to overcome. They were professionals. They could work together, but they were never quite friends again, not in the way they had been. And both of them, in their own ways, regretted that for the rest of their lives.